Drift into a quiet night aboard a sleeper train bound for the Alps. By the time the night train was ready to leave, Elias Brandt had already noticed three small things that did not belong to an ordinary crossing. A countess traveling without her maid, a young musician who would not let his violin out of reach, and a silence beyond the station that seemed to have come down early from the mountains. He stood where he always stood, a little to one side of the first-class door, close enough to receive the passengers without blocking the brass step. He had learned long ago that a railway carriage, like a church or a household, had its own proper threshold. People liked to be met there. They liked the reassurance of a familiar cap, a gloved hand, a voice that knew the order of things. His uniform was brushed, his buttons fastened, his ticket punch resting flat inside the pocket of his coat. The station lamps, still burning low and gold, caught on the metal of his cap badge and on the carriage fittings beside him. Along the line of coaches, polished handles and numbered compartment plates began to gleam one by one, as though the train were waking in sections. There was no hurry, not yet. The engine waited somewhere ahead in a patient cloud of its own making, giving out now and then a low sigh that drifted back beneath the roof. Coal smoke mingled with the sharper scent of hot metal. Underfoot, the stone platform held the damp of the day, and with it, a faint mineral coldness that seemed already to belong to the mountains. Elias took out his pocket watch, opened the silver case beneath the lamp, and compared it with the station clock. The time was not in doubt, but the gesture belonged to departure as much as the whistle, the raised hand of the guard, or the last glance of a passenger back along the platform. He listened for the familiar private ticking, a tiny, orderly sound inside all the steam and movement, then closed the watch with a quiet click and felt the night settle into its proper shape. The train, for one night only, would be a narrow little world, arranged by compartments, corridors, lamps, and linen. Elias understood this better than most. Once the doors were closed, each person became part of the same movement through the dark, kept company by the same wheels and the same uncertain hush beyond the windows. A conductor knew how to help people arrive, but he did not always know what they carried with them. Countess Odile Meunier arrived with the first deepening of the dusk. She came alone, as Elias had known she would, and carried only one case, though a porter followed at a respectful distance, as if prepared to assist should she change her mind. She was a slight woman, in a dark traveling coat, with a hat pinned carefully against the evening air, and a folded shawl over one arm. Nothing about her suggested effort. Even the damp shine of the platform seemed around her to become part of a proper departure. "Good evening, Herr Brandt," she said. "Good evening, Countess. Compartment 3, as before." She gave the smallest smile. "You remember everything." "Only the useful things, madame." That pleased her, though she did not say so. She handed him her ticket, and Elias inspected it with the formal care that belonged to the office. She had made this journey before, always arranging herself in the same corner of the same kind of compartment. Elias opened the door, stepped aside, and watched her place one gloved hand on the rail before entering. She traveled lightly, but not carelessly. Whatever she carried seemed to be kept in her habits rather than her luggage. Other passengers followed in quiet succession. A banker from Basel, a mother traveling with a grown daughter, a man with newspapers folded beneath one arm. Elias checked the names, repeated the compartment numbers, and made certain no one was unsettled by the close timing of departure. There was comfort in being told exactly where one belonged. At last, when the platform had grown thinner and the gaslight shone more strongly against the blue of the air, Jonas Aby appeared at the far end of the train. Elias noticed him first by the way he carried his luggage. One case hung from his left hand in the usual fashion. The other, longer and narrower, he held close against his side, protected beneath his arm, as one might carry a sleeping child through a draft. He was young, or young enough for travel still to sit visibly upon him. His coat was well cut, but worn at the cuffs, and his hair had been flattened by a hat he was no longer wearing. When he reached Elias, he stopped with a little breath of apology, though he was not late. "Aby," he said, producing his ticket. "Jonas Aby, Vienna to Lausanne." "You are expected, Herr Aby, compartment 7. Elias glanced at the violin case, not too long and not too obviously. "Would you like that placed above?" Jonas's hand tightened by instinct. Then he gave a shy smile. "If it may stay with me." "Of course. Instruments prefer company on cold nights." The young man looked relieved, and that was enough. Elias opened the door for him, took the ordinary case, and left the violin where it was, tucked close to its owner's ribs. The last porter stepped down. Far ahead, the engine released a longer sigh, and along the platform, a guard lifted his whistle. For a moment, nothing moved. Elias liked that moment best, the held breath between all the preparations and the journey itself. Steam drifted past the windows. The brass handles shone. Somewhere inside the train, a case shifted into place with a soft thud. Then the whistle sounded, clear but not sharp, and the carriages gave their first gentle lurch. Couplings tightened, one after another, down the length of the train. the platform began to slide, slowly at first, past the windows and the open door where Elias stood holding the rail. Faces in lamplight moved away. The station clock slipped behind a veil of steam. With one practiced motion, Elias closed the door, checked the latch, and stepped into the warm corridor as the night train drew itself out of the town. The wheels found their rhythm gradually, clattering over points and yard tracks before settling into the old 4-beat measure Elias knew in his bones. It was a sound that made some passengers wakeful and others sleepy almost at once. To him, it meant the night's work had properly begun. At each compartment, he knocked softly before entering. Curtains were drawn, lamps were adjusted, berths, still folded into the walls, waited above upholstered seats until required. Some passengers preferred to sit a while in their traveling clothes, reading or watching their own reflections tremble in the darkening glass. Others wanted the beds made down at once, as if by arranging linen they might persuade sleep to arrive on schedule. In compartment 3, Countess Odile had already begun her familiar arrangement. Her traveling clock stood on the small ledge by the window, angled so that she could see it without lifting her head. Her shawl had been folded once lengthwise and placed within reach, not around her shoulders, but beside her, ready for later. A slim book lay face down on the seat, though Elias could not remember ever seeing her read more than a page before sleep claimed her. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Elias glanced at the clock, the shawl, the book, and then at the lamp, which was burning a little too high. He lowered the flame until the light settled amber and quiet. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. There was no need to ask whether the berth should be prepared later. He knew, and she knew that he knew. Such understandings belonged to the better kinds of travel, formed not by intimacy, but by repetition. He closed the door gently behind him and continued along the corridor. Compartment 7 held a different sort of quiet. Jonas Aby sat by the window with his violin case beside him on the seat, exactly as he had wished. His ordinary case had been stowed overhead, but the instrument remained close, its dark leather catching a dull gleam from the lamp. The young man had removed his gloves and was rubbing warmth into his fingers, one by one, with the absent care of someone for whom hands were not merely useful, but necessary. "From Vienna, you said?" Elias asked as he straightened the curtain cord. "Yes, only 2 months this time." Jonas looked towards the black window, where his own face floated above the faint suggestion of fields. "Lessons, mostly. A little playing when I was allowed. And now, home." Jonas smiled, not broadly, but with relief. "For a little while. I shall come back when you are ready for the birth, he said. Not yet, thank you. Jonas rested his palm lightly on the violin case. I think I'll sit with it a while. The answer was tender, without intending to be. Elias left him to the dark window and the companionable box beside him. Elias went on with his work. He folded down a berth, fetched an extra blanket, closed a trembling ventilation catch, and lowered one lamp that had been left too bright. None of these acts was large enough to be remembered in the morning, and that was partly why he valued them. He thought of Countess Odile's clock, angled just so, and Jonas Aby's violin case, kept close beside him on the seat. Each passenger had brought some private order aboard and placed it carefully within the larger order of the train. That, Elias thought, was why departures felt ceremonial rather than mechanical. They were not merely beginnings. They were agreements to be carried for a while. By then, the town had almost fallen away. The train ran past low houses with shuttered windows, then through a cutting where the last light vanished, and the glass showed only the corridor lamps behind him. In the dining car, men would soon be unfolding napkins. In the luggage van, trunks would be rocking gently in their straps. Somewhere, a door clicked, then another. The whole train was learning the night. The train ran on, gathering the countryside into darkness behind it. Somewhere ahead lay colder stations, high ridges not yet visible, and the line that would carry them through stone and snow. For now, there was only the lowland night, the warmth of the corridor, and the steady persuasion of wheels. Then, from the direction of the dining car, a small bell rang. Not loudly. It was a silver sound, softened by distance and wood and the motion of the train. It trembled once through the corridor, then again, calling the last seating of the evening. Elias straightened, listening until the note had faded into the rhythm beneath the floor. Then he turned towards the dining car, where lamplight and white linen waited, and where the night, having carried everyone safely away from the platform, was ready to become something a little more companionable. The dining car received the passengers in warm squares of lamplight laid over white cloths, bowls, cups, and silver. Outside, the low country had begun to tilt towards the hills, and the cold window glass gathered a soft mist where breath and tea steam met the dark. Peter Solms moved between the tables with quiet economy. A bowl was set down while still giving off a savory breath. A basket of bread followed beneath a folded napkin. The tea came in a small pot whose silvered sides caught the lamp flames in wavering lines. It was a simple supper, the sort of late meal that belonged properly to a night train, rather than to a hotel dining room. Yet the old forms of service were observed carefully. Linen was laid smooth. Cutlery had been placed in order. Bowls came from the warming cupboard without clatter. Even the modestness of the food seemed, in that narrow moving room, to become part of the comfort. Countess Odile Meunier sat near the middle of the car, at a table for two that was not quite hers, and not quite shared until Jonas Aby was shown to the opposite seat. Peter had judged the arrangement with tact. The other tables were already occupied, and the Countess, though accustomed to traveling alone, had the calm of someone who did not object to quiet company when it presented itself properly. Jonas placed his violin case between his feet, where one knee could rest lightly against it, and sat with the careful straightness of a young man still deciding how much space he was allowed to take. The Countess noticed this, as she noticed most things, but she did not look directly at the case. Instead, she unfolded her napkin and let the train move them into conversation at its own pace. "Herr Aby, is it?" she asked after Peter had poured the tea. "Yes, madame. I heard you say Vienna on the platform. Have you come from there today?" "From there yesterday, really. Today has been mostly stations." He smiled at the accuracy of it. "But yes, I have been studying there. Music, I think." His glance dipped briefly towards the case. "Violin." The Countess stirred her soup once, without tasting it yet. "Vienna must be a city that makes it difficult to know whether one is practicing music or merely living inside it." Jonas looked up, surprised into warmth. "That is nearly true. In some streets, if a window is open, you hear scales. In others, it is a piano being tuned, or someone singing badly with great confidence. Even silence there feels as if it has just finished a piece." "Then you must be glad to return to the country," she said. He considered this as the train rounded a gentle curve. Outside, a cluster of village lights appeared below them. Not far below, but just enough to show that the line had begun to lift. A church spire stood black against a last paleness in the west, then was gone. "Glad, yes," Jonas said, "and uncertain. Vienna felt enormous when I arrived. Then it became almost ordinary. Now home may feel strange for a day or two, as if it has continued without asking me." His hand rested against the violin case beneath the table. "I thought I was bringing music home. Now I wonder whether I am bringing back a different way of hearing it." The Countess nodded. "Places do that. People too, though we are less willing to admit it." Peter returned with the bread, setting the basket between them. "A little more tea when you are ready, madame. Herr Aby?" "Thank you, Peter," said the Countess. Peter inclined his head and was already attending to a cup at the next table. In the dining car, he moved by quiet rhythm. Serve, remove, refill, withdraw. A passenger might remember a spill or a delay. They rarely remembered ease unless it was missing. So he kept to the rhythm, letting the supper pass as gently as the train itself. Elias entered while the supper was halfway through. He did not belong to the dining car in quite the same way Peter did. His territory was the sleeping compartments and corridors, the latches and berths, the list of names folded in his pocket. Still, the dining car was part of his night, and he moved through it as one checks a room in a house after dusk, not intruding, but making sure all was as it should be. "All comfortable, Countess?" he asked softly as he passed. "Very much. Herr Aby is telling me Vienna has more music than weather." "Then it is fortunate he is traveling home with both safely packed," Elias said. The Countess tore a piece of bread and buttered it with calm precision. "You asked after my destination, I think, or were about to." Jonas colored slightly. "I was curious. Herr Brandt said compartment 3 as before, so I thought perhaps you made the journey often." "Often enough to have preferences," she said. "My sister lives in a village above the lake. In summer, it is all geraniums and bells from the pastures. In winter, it becomes very small, as if the snow folds it in half." "Does she like that?" "She says she does. I believe her most of the time." The Countess looked towards the window, where the reflection of the dining car floated over a dark slope pricked with 2 or 3 lamps. "There is a church with a gray stone roof, a fountain that runs even in frost, and old men who complain in the same place outside the post office, whatever the season. It is a very steady village." Jonas listened with the attention he might have given a quiet passage of music. He could picture the village without being told too much. A bell tower, narrow lanes, smoke held low by winter air. It seemed to him that such places must change slowly, yet perhaps that was only how they appeared to those who arrived from somewhere else. Perhaps it was because the train asked so little of him. He did not have to arrive yet, or explain what Vienna had changed in him. He was between the 2 homes of himself, neither fully the young man who had left, nor the one who would step down in the morning. Among strangers, under lamps, with the violin at his feet and the wheels speaking below, he could simply be carried. The Countess, who had learned over many years when not to interrupt a silence, finished her tea and looked out with him. For a little while, they traveled in companionable quiet, the sort that arrives when conversation has done its work well enough to be allowed to rest. "Good night, Herr Aby," she said. "Good night, Countess." She glanced once towards the violin case, not inquisitively, but kindly. "May it sleep well, too." Jonas smiled. "It usually complains less than I do." Jonas remained seated a moment longer while Peter cleared the table. Then the train altered under him. Not sharply, not even enough to disturb the cleared saucers, but unmistakably. The forward pull deepened. The wheels seemed to take a slower thought before each answer from the rails. Peter felt it too. He looked up from the stack of bowls and smiled faintly, as if recognizing an old acquaintance. "We are climbing now, sir." Outside, the few remaining lights no longer lay level with the train, but below it, gathered in hollows. A moment before, they had belonged to villages. Now, they seemed to belong to the land itself, scattered carefully among slopes and orchards, each one held apart from the next by fields the dark had already taken. Jonas nodded, though he had already known. Outside, the last of those lights seemed to sink gently into the folds of the hills, leaving the dining car quieter than before, its linen marked with the faint evidence of the meal, its windows nearly black. He lifted the violin case carefully and made his way back towards the sleepers, following the others into the corridor where the air was cooler and the rhythm of the engine came through more clearly. Slower now, more deliberate, as though each breath of steam had to be placed upon the track with care. Elias was already on his later round, moving from compartment to compartment with a shaded hand lamp. The train had changed its voice. On the level it had run with a confident, rolling measure. Now the engine worked in a slower, steadier chug, each stroke placed carefully against the rising grade. At compartment 3, Elias found the Countess seated once more beside her little traveling clock. The berth was ready now, the linen drawn smooth, the blanket folded back in a shallow triangle. Her shawl had been moved from the seat to the hook beside the door, and her book lay unopened where she had left it. "Shall I lower the lamp further?" Elias asked. "A little, if you please." He did so, and the room softened at once. She looked past him to the window. "The hills have begun." "Yes, madame. We should make the first request stop before long." "Will anyone be waiting there?" "Sometimes a post bag. Sometimes no one at all." This seemed to satisfy her. There was something pleasing about a train slowing for a place that might or might not need it, as if courtesy could be extended even to an empty platform in the dark. Elias wished her good night and closed the door. Elias paused by the corridor window as the whistle came, thin and softened by distance from the engine. Outside, a small station emerged from the dark. One lamp, one bench, one notice board glossed with damp. A post bag was exchanged in a moment, and then the platform slipped away. He watched until the station lamp was no larger than a bead. The postman remained visible for a few seconds, turning back towards the village path with his empty hand swinging at his side. Then he too was gone, folded into the dark with the bench, the notice board, and the small kindness of a stop made properly. When Elias reached compartment 7, Jonas had not undressed. He sat on the edge of the made berth with the violin case open beside him. The instrument lay in its velvet hollow, brown varnish dim under the lamp. He was not playing. He had loosened the bow and laid it safely aside, and now he touched one peg, then another, coaxing the strings with barely audible turns. The notes, when they came, were no more than breaths, a low murmur, a thread of sound, a question asked too quietly to require an answer. Elias knocked with 2 fingers on the open door frame. "All well?" Jonas looked up at once. "I'm sorry, it is not too loud?" "I heard less than the train hears of itself." That reassured him. "I was only checking. The cold changes it. The cold changes most things on this line." Jonas smiled and rested his hand flat across the strings, silencing them completely. Elias noticed the gesture. Protective, affectionate, practiced. The young man was not tuning for performance, but for company. He was checking that what mattered had survived the first climb unchanged. "Would you like the window curtain drawn?" Elias asked. Jonas looked out. There was little to see now except his reflection, and beyond it, a suggestion of rock rising where the sky should have been. "Not yet. I like to know when the lights are gone." Elias understood. He left the curtain as it was and wished him good night. The train continued upward, its rhythm slower now and closer to the body, like a second pulse beneath the ribs. At last, there was only one lamp left, far below and far behind. Jonas saw it too from compartment 7, his hand resting quietly on the closed violin case. Elias watched from the corridor window as the small point of light held, narrowed, and finally was taken by the dark. Elias had seen passengers guard luggage, letters, and sleep. But tonight, he found himself thinking that the things people protected most carefully were not always the things most likely to break. No one announced the change. The train simply went on, and the world outside became larger and simpler. Open darkness pressed close to the glass. The rising shapes of rock took over where roofs and spires had been. Above them, though not yet fully seen, the high country waited in moonlit stillness, and the night train climbed towards it with all its little rooms warm, ordered, and quietly awake. The darkness did not remain empty for long. As the train climbed higher, the night beyond the corridor windows began to clarify, not by dawn, but by an older, colder light. The moon had risen beyond the ridges, and little by little, the black glass ceased to be a mirror. Elias saw the pale edge of a slope, then the lifted shoulder of a mountain, then a white sweep of snowfield taking the moonlight. He had meant only to check the window latch. The latch was secure, the lamp behind him trimmed, the compartments on either side quiet. Yet he did not move on. The train had reached a high traverse, and the view outside had opened so quietly that even a man accustomed to it felt the old permission to pause. Below the line, the valley dropped away into blue shadow. Above it, slopes rose in long plains of snow, broken by dark shelves of rock and the black-green points of trees. Higher still, the glaciers lay in moonlight, bright and motionless to the eye, carrying within them a slow history of weather no timetable could measure. The train slowed a little as it took the pass. To the passengers, it came only as a change in the rhythm beneath them. The wheels, so constant through the foothills, now seemed to choose each beat more carefully. Outside, there was almost nothing else to hear. No village dog, no church bell, no road below. In high alpine valleys at night, sound could carry strangely across snowfields or vanish altogether. Silence seemed to gather under the moon. The cold was present even through the glass. It did not enter as a draught, for the frame was well closed, but it radiated faintly from the pane, a nearness of winter against the skin. Elias felt it along his cheek and at the knuckles of the hand resting lightly on the brass rail. It had a different quality from the damp cold of the station or the clean chill of the foothills. This was height, mineral, and dry. A door opened behind him with such care that he heard not the handle, but the slight change of air. Countess Odile Meunier stepped into the corridor, wearing her shawl about her shoulders. Her hair, loosened from the pins of travel, had been gathered simply at the nape of her neck. She did not appear startled to find him there. Perhaps the moonlight had drawn her from sleep, or perhaps, as Elias suspected, she had not yet fully entered sleep at all. He moved as if to make room, but she lifted one hand, not quite stopping him, only making clear that there was already enough space. They stood side by side at the corridor window, a conductor and a countess in the narrow warmth of a sleeping car, looking out together at a world where such distinctions had no particular use. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not awkward, because it did not belong to them alone. It had already been laid over the valley, over the train, over the sleeping compartments, and the dining car gone dim behind them. The moon had cleared a ridge now, and its light widened across the pass. A glacier showed itself more plainly, its surface not smooth, but faintly ribbed and shadowed, like folded linen made of ice. Snowfields descended from it in long, pale bands, broken by black outcrops where the mountain shouldered through. The sky above was so clear that the peaks seemed cut from it rather than standing before it. "It is always larger at night," the Countess said at last. Her voice was barely more than breath, but it carried in the narrow corridor. "Yes," Elias said. "Daylight explains too much." He stepped back from the window with reluctance so slight that only he would have known it. The Countess remained a moment longer. Then she drew her shawl closer, not because she seemed chilled, but because the gesture completed the pause, and turned towards her compartment. Elias opened the door for her. The little traveling clock inside ticked more clearly than before, sat upon its ledge in the low lamplight, counting seconds with a patience that felt almost domestic after the moonlit valley. "Good night, Herr Brandt," she said. "Good night, Madame." He closed the door gently and stood for one more breath in the corridor, letting the wheel rhythm gather around him again. Then he resumed his round. The sleeping carriage had changed during the pause at the window. It was not quieter in any measurable way. The train still moved. The lamp flames still trembled faintly in their glass, and the boards still answered the cold with tiny adjustments. Yet the human sounds had retreated. Conversation had ended. Pages had stopped turning. The day's outward life had folded inward. Elias moved from door to door with the shaded hand lamp held low. Where a lamp burned too brightly, he lowered it. Where a curtain had slipped, he restored it. Where a boot stood in the narrow passage of a compartment, he set it just beneath the berth. His work had become so quiet that it seemed less like service than like keeping faith with sleep. In compartment 3, Countess Odile had settled beneath the blanket, with her shawl folded across her feet. The traveling clock stood beside her, ticking distinctly in the hush. Elias saw only enough. One hand outside the coverlet, the calm angle of the clock, the lamp lowered to its final glow. Compartment 7 was darker than before. Jonas Aby had at last surrendered to the train. He lay turned slightly towards the wall, one arm drawn around the closed violin case, which rested along the berth beside him under a fold of blanket. It was not an elegant arrangement, but it was a familiar one, and Elias did not disturb it. The young man's hand lay against the worn leather with the same unconscious trust one might place upon a rail when climbing stairs in a childhood house. A faint line of moonlight showed beneath the edge of the curtain Jonas had left partly open. It crossed the lower wall and rested on the corner of the case, making the scuffs and softened seams visible. Elias thought of the barely breathed notes he had heard earlier. The tuning that had not been music, and yet had belonged to music all the same. Now even that private care had come to rest. The banker from Basel slept with his spectacles safe on the shelf. The mother and daughter had turned in sleep towards the same side of their compartment, each in the direction of the other, without touching. The man with the newspapers breathed with steady seriousness, as if even sleep were a matter requiring proper management. Elias lowered the remaining lamp. Without the warm center of the meal, the dining car gave itself back to the night. Moonlight fell across bare table edges and the polished curve of a spoon, and the room seemed to hold the memory of voices after the voices had gone. Earlier, the dining car had been the train's heart. Now, that heart had dispersed into the ticking clock, the hand on the violin case, the careful breathing behind every closed door, and the unseen driver reading the line ahead. A night train was never asleep in the simple sense. It rested by division of labor. The train was still climbing, though not as steeply now. The wheel rhythm had steadied into something unbroken and deep, a sound that belonged less to speed than to continuation. At the end of his round, Elias stood with one hand on the rail, listening. The train moved through the heart of the Alps, with its little rooms dimmed and ordered. Nothing needed to happen. Nothing needed to be said. The night held. The wheels kept their measure, and the small traveling clock ticked on into the stillness ahead. The train went on into the last deep part of the night, when even wakefulness seemed to have softened its edges. Elias stood in the guard's van with his watch open in his hand, though he had no true need of it. The hour could be felt without looking. Through the window at the end of the van, the rear lamp burned steadily red. Beyond it, the line they had crossed was taken back at once by darkness. Above the track, very high, one ridge had begun to lose its blackness. A gray touch, a paler edge, the first suggestion that the highest peaks knew of morning before the valleys did. Elias watched it without waiting for it to become dawn. Dawn was still far off for the train, hidden behind mountains, tunnels, and the long folds of the route. Down where the carriages ran, the world remained almost entirely dark. But the peaks were touched first. They always were. The wheels continued unchanged beneath everything. They had carried the supper conversation, the moonlit pause, the ticking clock, Jonas's sleeping hand upon the violin case. Now they carried breath behind closed doors, a conductor with his watch, and a driver reading the line ahead. No further checks were required. Elias knew this, and knowing it did not make him restless. The lamps had been lowered. The doors were secure. The compartments had settled around their occupants. The dining car was dark. The rear lamp burned. The train had become what it was meant to become: a moving shelter, ordered and quiet, asking of him now only presence. The watch ticked. The wheels answered. The red lamp held. Behind him, beyond the service passage and the dark dining car, the sleeping compartments remained closed. He could not see Countess Odile's traveling clock or Jonas's violin case, but he did not need to. Their quiet reached him as part of the train's quiet, a held breath distributed along the length of the carriages. He closed the watch once more, and this time returned it to his pocket. The chain settled against his waistcoat. His hand remained there a moment, resting over the place where the ticking had been. Then he turned from the rear window and stepped back towards the corridor, leaving the red lamp to its steady watch over the track behind. The corridor felt different now that there was almost nothing left to do in it. Earlier, it had been a place of tasks, tickets, lamps, berths, curtains, questions answered in low voices. Now it was simply a corridor, warm enough, dim enough, moving steadily through the dark. Its brass handles had lost their brightness. Its wood panels held the last low amber from the lamps. The corridor held its hush. The passengers slept. The mountains passed unseen in the dark. Elias stood quietly with the train around him, and the rhythm beneath the floor remained entirely unchanged. Wheels over rail, breath behind doors, gray on the highest peaks, and still, softly and steadily, the train going on.